Hi, folks. Today we're going to talk about two concepts that are relevant to some of our upcoming work, intersectionality and reader response theory. So let's start with a discussion of intersectionality. This is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to address the complexity of identity and the plurality of identities. So Crenshaw writes that intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So essentially, Crenshaw is encouraging us to think about the overlap and the colliding that happens in cases where you're considering a variety of different identity markers in relation to a single person. So how does this relate to the work that we're doing with A Raisin in the Sun? So one of the things to consider with narrative literature is that characters are all often very complex and multifaceted, and so it can be worthwhile to consider what defines the characters, what kinds of identity groups did they seem to fit into, and if we were going to take a more intersectional approach, we might also ask ourselves, how do these different identity groups interact or overlap or clash with each other? For example, Beneatha Younger in A Raisin in the Sun is a person of color, but she is also a woman, and we might consider how those two different identity markers relate to how she exists within the play, how those identity markers shape her story. And these kinds of questions can sometimes be productive in digging deeper into the text if you're particularly interested in character. There are also a few additional questions I've included here that may be of interest. And I think that it might be worthwhile to try to parse some of these out on your own and draw your own conclusions. Of course, when we're dealing with fictional characters, one of the challenges is making sure that we're not making too many blanket assumptions. And so we have to really pay attention to what's actually in the text. But I think that there are some things that you'll be able to parse out and identify and consider in relation to some of these questions here. All right, so our next order of business is to talk about reader response theory. And I paired this with a discussion of intersectionality because identity is very much important to reader response. So reader response theory is very concerned with how the role of the reader is integral in creating meaning from the text. So you can imagine that part of this is considering diversity amongst readers and how different parts of a reader's identity might influence the way they respond to a text or the kind of meaning that they get out of it. So you will have a much more detailed resource to peruse on reader response as you have for most of our literary theories, but I wanted to pose some sample questions that reader response critics might ask just to get the ball rolling and get you thinking along those lines. So the first question deals more with the personal experience of reading a text. And I think this is something that you could easily do as you're working on the text that we're dealing with right now. You could stop and take stock of the way that you're responding to the text and what you're getting of the text, and then ask yourself where those impressions are coming from. Is there anything unique to you and your experience in the moment that are, that might be relevant to what you're getting out of the text? So a more objective path of analysis might be to look at what other people have said about the text. So a lot of times people or reader response theorists might look at the body of literary criticism on a piece of literature and ask themselves, where are these interpretations coming from? How might these interpretations be related to the analyst? Are there any contextual factors that may have contributed to the conclusions that they drew in their analyses? And then a final point is to consider the structure of the text itself on a very fundamental level. So, considering things like how wording, syntax, and just the general text based format, how that might impact a reader, that can be very significant. For example, in Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, a significant portion of the story is told through footnotes, making the format in a really integral part of the narrative itself. And so that's a very stylized formatting feature that might hit differently with different readers. Some readers might respond to the complexity in a very positive way and think it's a clever way to structure a book, and some people might find it very alienating. I think we come across things like that with historical literature as well, because sometimes the conventions of writing 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, are very different than the conventions of the 21st century. And so sometimes someone going back and reading Henry James or Herman Melville might have a very different experience of that text than someone who was reading it during the time it was produced. So those can be some really interesting considerations too. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of questions that you could consider as a reader response analyst, but I'm hoping that it will give you a little bit of a starting point as we continue to dig deeper into that theory.